And we have 3 children and 10 grandchildren. I know I only look 39, but I'm much older than that. But anyway, we live in Dixon, Tennessee, about 40 miles west of Nashville. We moved there about a year and a half ago. And I work for the Sunset International Bible Institute out of Lubbock, Texas, and I direct a program for them called SALT, which is the Sunset Academy of Leadership Training. And I travel across the country many weekends every year to work with congregations in areas of leadership and leadership development and church growth. Today, and some of those things we'll share as we go throughout each week. So a few years ago, I did a little survey. I sent out an email to, I don't know, about 150, 200 people that I know, preachers, youth ministers, friends. And I did this survey. I asked 2 questions in the survey. And so I'm going to ask those 2 questions to you as well. But they're not difficult questions, but they were simply this. 1, of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, which one is your favorite to read? Now, I know that the tendency is to say, well, I like all 4 of them. Well, I like all 4 of them too. But if you had to pick one, which gospel would you pick that you would say is your favorite? And then the second question was, why is that your favorite? So I'll just ask you, which one is your favorite to read? If you had to pick one, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, which one of those 4 do you like to read the most? John. Why John? It's different than the other 3, the synoptics, yes?
John's what? Yep.
Why John for you?
Because it seems to be a little more personal.
Oh, okay. Personal, like that. Mark, why Mark?
I was running in my.
Oh. Okay. Oh, very nice, very nice. We're going to talk about Mark on Sunday morning in the worship hour, and I'll share some things from Mark that hopefully will be very encouraging. Okay. Luke, all right, that's good. I like that. Yep, the history of Luke. He does record accurately those historical facts. Yeah. Anyone else? I'm going to change your thinking on those gospels throughout this week, maybe. Yeah. Say which one? Matthew. Why Matthew? Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're gonna touch on Matthew when we get Friday. Talking about some things from Matthew. Yeah.
I was going to say Matthew too, because there seems to be more detail.
Oh, okay. A lot more detail. Very interesting. Yeah. Matthew, and a different kind of detail in the way that he approaches it. So very good. Yeah. If you had to guess in the survey that I took, what would you guess would be the one that people pick the most as their favorite gospel to read? Which one do you think it would be?
John.
Is that because it's your name? It was John. 6-1. Isn't that interesting? 6-1. People chose John over Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there were a lot of different reasons that were given. And tomorrow night we're going to focus on some things from the Gospel of John. But one of my favorite, and you kind of touched on it, about the personal nature of John. And you really do see Jesus on kind of that one-on-one personal level in the Gospel of John. But one guy wrote, when I asked why was it his favorite, he said, I just think it would be so awesome to write about your best friend. And I thought, what a neat perspective about the Gospel of John. Matthew came in second in the survey, and for the same reasons. Several folks really loved the Sermon on the Mount. And as I said, we're going to talk about that on Friday night. We'll talk about the Gospel of Matthew and some things from that Gospel. Some people really like the birth narrative. Matthew chapters 1 and 2, you really have that detailed birth narrative of not just the genealogy theological record, but you have the Magi that traveled in and the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and all of it goes along with that. So several people like that. But yeah, Matthew came in second. Mark came in third. I really thought Mark would come in first because it's the shortest. It's the easiest and quickest to read. But a lot of people like Mark. The thing about Mark, and I'll talk about this on Sunday, I had a colleague, friend of mine, that when he responded to why he liked Mark, he said it's the only gospel that begins with Jesus as an adult. And I'd never thought about that until he made that statement. I mean, you've got Matthew and Luke that deal with the birth narratives, and then you've got John that goes all the way back to time before the beginning, and then you have Mark that starts right off the bat. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it deals with him as an adult going into his ministry. But Luke is the one we're going to focus on tonight. And Luke is one of those interesting gospels to me. There are a lot of things about the gospel of Luke that are fascinating to me and very unique to the gospel of Luke. For example, the gospel begins and it ends with death. Isn't that interesting? I mean, in chapter 1, you have there in the very first chapter the birth of John the Baptist. Well, his father Zacharias is in the temple. He's offering incense. And an angel appears to him, the archangel appears to him and tells him that his prayers have been heard and his wife is going to bear a son and he will call his name John. And Zacharias doubted. Have you ever prayed and doubted even when the answer was there? I have. I mean, there are times I just like, hard to believe that it happened. I asked for it and it happened. And it's kind of like I'm still wondering in doubt. But then you get to the end of the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 24, you got the apostles all huddled together. And Jesus appears to them and he says, why does doubt fill your hearts? And I believe that everywhere, these are like bookends to me, everywhere in between these 2 points, in chapter 1 and chapter 24, Luke records accurately, historically, to remove all doubt from our minds as to who Jesus is. Now, when you look through the Gospel of Luke, it also does something very unique, or at least I think it's unique. Because when you look at Matthew, as we'll talk about on Friday night, Matthew is a gospel that was really kind of written from the standpoint of helping us see Jesus as a master teacher. And as we'll talk about then, there are 5 major teaching sections in the Gospel of Matthew. You have this Bible, you have this major teaching section, and you have miracles, and then you have followers, and you have major teaching section, you have miracles, you have followers. So you have 5 of those in the Gospel of Matthew. So it's like Matthew really wants us to see Jesus as this masterful, all-wise teacher. And of course, the greatest sermon ever in the Sermon on the Mount. And when you look at John, John wants us to see Jesus as God in the flesh. I mean, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And of course, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld His glory. Glory is the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So we have this image here, and when you read through, as we'll talk about tomorrow night, when you read through the Gospel of John, you continue to see this emphasis upon Jesus as God in the flesh. And then when you read Mark, Mark really paints this interesting picture, as we'll talk about Sunday morning, about Jesus. And he wants us to see Jesus as this amazing miracle worker. Because you have 17 miracles just in the first 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. You only have 3 in the back half. There's this major change that takes place we'll talk about Sunday morning. But it's interesting to see the miracles that Jesus does in the Gospel of Mark. But when we get to Luke, it's not that Luke is trying to keep us from seeing Jesus differently, but the thing about Luke that fascinates me the most is that Luke writes to help us see other people through the eyes of Jesus. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here in just a second. But as we go through this lesson, if you've seen the flyer, you know that the title of the lesson tonight is about the way that we see Jesus changes the way that we see others. And so in the end, we're going to really talk about the idea of how do we see Jesus, because that impacts the way that we see others. But to give you a perspective of what I'm talking about, when you look in Luke chapter 7, there's this incredible account at the end of the chapter where Jesus goes to the house of a Pharisee by the name of Simon. And there is a woman, and the text there, the New American Standard, it just simply says that she was an immoral woman. We don't know the details of what that means or the depth of that or her immorality. It just says that she was an immoral woman. But she comes in and she begins to wet the feet of Jesus with her tears, and she dries them with the hair from her head, and she anoints his head with oil, perfume, of expensive perfume. But Simon, in his mind, is thinking, if this man were a prophet, he would know what manner of woman this is and would not let her touch him. Well, Jesus, of course, knew what Simon was thinking, and he says, Simon, I have something to say to you. And Simon says, say it, teacher. He says, there were a man had two debtors. One that owed him 500 denarii, and one that owed him 50. And when neither one could repay, he graciously forgave them both. So which one do you think loved him more? He says, I guess the one that he forgave the most. He said, you've answered correctly. And then Jesus says this. Do you see this woman? Do you see this woman? I came into your house, you gave me no water to wash my feet, yet she has continually wet my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. And you gave me no oil to anoint my head, and yet she has anointed me with perfume. And I tell you that her sins that are many are forgiven because she loved much. Now, every time I read that account, every time I go through that, I can't help but think, when I see people out here in the world, people that are immoral people in the world, how do I look at them? How do I see them? Do I see them through the eyes of a Pharisee? Or do I see them through the eyes of Jesus? If you go over a couple of chapters, you're going to find a very familiar account that we hear taught a lot. And it's about a certain lawyer who comes to Jesus, wants to know about eternal life. They get in this discussion. And he wants to know about the greatest command. And Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. Second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And this young man, or this certain lawyer, he wants to justify himself. And he says to Jesus, because Jesus tells him he's answered correctly, and he says, who then is my neighbor? And so Jesus then begins to relate to him this account of a man who was traveling between Jerusalem and Jericho. And he fell in the hands of robbers, and they beat him, they stripped him, and they left him to die. And then the text says that a certain priest happened by that way, and notice it explicitly points out that when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. And then the text says that a certain Levite also happened by that way, and when he saw the man, he too passed by on the other side. But there was a certain Samaritan. And you have to realize that this was the perfect illustration to help this man realize where he was at, because Jews hated Samaritans. There was a certain Samaritan. When he happened by that way, when he saw the man, he had compassion. He bound up his wounds with oil and wine, put him on his donkey, took him to an inn to take care of him. He paid the innkeeper, and the next day he said, when I come back this way, if he owes you anything, I will repay it. And Jesus asked this lawyer, which of these three proved to be a neighbor? And he couldn't even say the Samaritan. He just said, the one who showed mercy. And Jesus said, go and do the same. I don't know about Albert Lee. I've never been here before. But in Tennessee, in Dixon, Tennessee especially, we have a lot of people Some are homeless, some who are recovering addicts, some people who are just struggling mentally, financially. They're just down on luck. Some who are suffering in great ways. And I have to ask myself, when I see people like that are suffering in those situations, do I see them through the eyes of a priest and a Levite? Or do I see them through the eyes of compassion, like Jesus? And then you just go over a few more chapters, chapter 19, you find the account of Zacchaeus. Remember Zacchaeus? When I was growing up, we used to sing that song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and wee little man was he, climbed up in the sycamore tree with the Savior he wanted to see. I don't know how big a wee little man is, but the text tells us that he was short in stature, he was small. He couldn't see Jesus because he wasn't tall enough to see over the crowd. So what he did was he ran ahead and he climbs up in this sycamore tree because he wanted to see Jesus. And of course, Jesus walks right up to him and he tells him to come down. He says, because I'm going to your house today. And you remember the crowds? They're like, how can this man go to the house of a sinner? And of course, Jesus talked about how that he too was a son of Abraham. He says, today salvation has come to your house. For the Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. Now when I read that account, I have to ask myself, when I see people that are different than me, when I see people who don't look like me, maybe they're different in stature, maybe they're different in the color of their skin, maybe they're different in their economic status, maybe they're just different than me. How do I see them? Do I see them through the eyes of people who just think that they're sinners? Or do I see them through the eyes of salvation, through the eyes of Jesus? There are so many other texts throughout the Gospel of Luke that highlight this same kind of thinking about how we see others. Because how we see Jesus really does change the way that we see others. But it brings me to the text that I want us to spend a little time talking about tonight at the end of the Gospel of Luke. If you have your Bibles, want to open up there to Luke chapter 24. We're not going to read through the entire text there, beginning in verse 13, but I want to highlight some things from this text and talk about some of the ideas that are taking place here. And you may be familiar with this text. It's kind of, while Mark does highlight a little bit of this idea, but Luke is the one who gives us very unique details to this situation with these two men on the road to Emmaus. And so it talks about these two men who were traveling from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and notice that the text highlights that it was about a 7-mile journey. Now I think that's important. We'll talk more about that in just a moment, but I think that's going to be a key geographical factor later. But they're traveling, and the text says that while they were walking on the road to Emmaus, they were talking about all these things that had taken place. Now, in my mind, I asked, okay, what were these things? Were they talking about the crucifixion? Yes, probably. The text doesn't say specifically. Were they talking about the women who said that they had seen an angel who had reported that Jesus was alive? Yes, probably. It may have been all these things and many more. All I know is it says they were talking about all these things, and while they were talking about these things, Jesus himself appeared alongside them. And notice what it says here in the text, that their eyes were prevented or kept, depending on your translation, from seeing him or recognizing him. Now, you're going to learn this week, my mind sometimes is a little twisted. It's a labyrinth up there. And I have to figure out, all these different things that are going on in my head. But here's the way my mind works. I read that for the first time, I don't know how long ago. And my first question was this: what kept them from seeing and recognizing Jesus? That was my question. What kept them? And so I started looking at some of the original language and the words that are found there, and realized that the words, it wasn't some external force. This wasn't God covering up their eyes so that they couldn't see or recognize Jesus. It was something inside of them. And so I began to think, okay, well, one, I just made this list. Number one, I thought, well, maybe it was a preconceived idea. And it's true that the Jews had this preconceived idea that the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, that Christ, when he came, he was going to be the strong military leader who would remove all Roman oppression from them. And then when they crucified him, they didn't recognize him. In fact, the text even points that out. You continue to read a little bit, because they're going to explain to Jesus that they had hoped that Jesus would redeem Israel. And when they crucified him, all their hope was gone. And so they didn't recognize him. And then I put second on my list that maybe they misunderstood Scripture. And I think that's pretty clear too from the text, because when you read the text, and Jesus is going to begin with Moses and the prophets and explain everything concerning himself from all of Scripture. I mean, there's no doubt that they totally misunderstood what the Scripture in the Old Testament taught in regards to the suffering of the Messiah. And then I thought, well, maybe it was kind of counterintuitive. It didn't make sense. And I think that's clear from the text too. If you back up verses 11 and 12, you're going to find that what took place here is that when the women came and reported about the angel that said that Jesus was raised from the dead, the text says it appeared to them as nonsense, and they refused to believe it. Can you imagine? I had a lady one time, she came up to me, and I've been teaching this lesson and talking about some of these things. And she said, have you ever thought about that maybe it was just out of context? Because the last time they saw Jesus, he was hanging on a Roman cross, a bloody mess from his head to his toes. Spear pierced his side, blood flowing everywhere. That's the way they saw him. Now, obviously, he didn't look like that as he's walking alongside them. It was kind of out of context. You ever had that happen to you? Where you saw somebody, you looked at them, and you're like, I was at Freed Hardeman's lectureship a couple years ago, and I was walking up to the gym, and we had our booth set up over there. And so I opened the door, and I noticed this couple that was coming up behind me, so I thought I'd be nice and hold the door for him. So I'm holding the door, and he walked right on through, and she stopped and stared at me. And I stared back, just being silly. And she started laughing. She goes, do you not know who I am? And the minute she started laughing, I was like, of course I know who you are. I didn't expect to see her in Henderson, Tennessee. The last time I saw her was in Tanzania, East Africa. It was a bit out of context for me. And so I didn't recognize her. I don't know that that's what happened. But I began to think in my mind about why it is that people don't see Jesus today. Have you ever thought about that? What is it that keeps people from seeing Jesus today? And I think really that some of these same reasons are true and valid. I think sometimes people have a preconceived idea as to who Jesus is and what Jesus is going to do in their life. I know personally of people that they thought that if they became a Christian, then their health problems would be resolved. They thought that if they became a Christian, their marital struggles would be fixed. That if they became a Christian, their financial problems would be relieved. And the list goes on and on. They thought that if they became a Christian, they had this preconceived idea that if they became a Christian, then Jesus was going to take care of all this stuff. And then when he didn't, they gave up. They didn't see him. They didn't recognize Jesus. And I think it's pretty evident in the world in which we live that a lot of times people don't recognize Jesus because they misunderstand Scripture. And sometimes it's because it's counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. We live in a scholastic world, if you will, academia, that has this mindset that it doesn't make sense that God would come in the flesh, that he would do these miracles and then allow people to crucify him. It doesn't make sense to them, so they try to explain all the miracles with naturalistic thinking, and then somehow just rationalize away who Jesus is. So they don't see Jesus. And when I was going through all of this, I had this horrifying thought. Because I thought, what if the reason people don't see Jesus is because of me? What if my words, my actions, my attitudes keep people from seeing Jesus? Because I don't want to be the reason people don't see him. I want to be the reason that people do see Jesus. And that's going to require a lot of change on my part. For people to see Jesus in me and not to be prevented from seeing Jesus. As you read through this text, there's something I think that stands out that is so significantly important in regards to this study. And that is where they do see him. Because if we continue to read in this text, what happens is this. They get to Emmaus, and Jesus acts as if he's going to go on. But they're like, no, it's getting late in the day. And so they ask Jesus to come inside, and so he does. And they sit down, and Jesus takes bread, he blesses it, and begins breaking it and giving it to them. And in that moment, the text very explicitly points out that then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And Jesus disappeared from their sight. And this is probably my favorite part of this whole text. I love how that they turned to each other and said, were our hearts not burning inside of us when we were with him on the road and he was explaining the scriptures to us? And they got up and they went back to Jerusalem. Now, I mentioned earlier it was a 7-mile journey. Personally, I think they ran it. I think they couldn't wait to get back there quick enough. They found the apostles, and when they found them, they said to them, Jesus is alive. He's really risen from the dead. He's appeared to Peter, and they explained to them everything that happened on the road and how they recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Now, there are two thoughts that I'm going to leave with you tonight. The first is this. The first thing they did when they recognized Jesus, when they knew it was him, they had to go tell someone else. They could not keep that to themselves. And I'm convinced, and maybe this is just pointing at me personally, but I'm convinced that when we recognize Jesus, when we know him, when we see him, we can't keep that to ourselves. You've got to tell someone else. Because isn't this what they call a game changer? I mean, isn't this something that makes the difference? If Jesus really has been raised from the dead, doesn't that change everything? Because what that means is that this life is not it. There's something beyond this life. That changes everything. I just recently had a conversation with a friend of mine. We were talking about the death of Ed Horton. I don't know if you know who Ed Horton is or not, but Ed Horton was one of the founding people of the Bear Valley Bible Institute. He's been a teacher at Sunset for about, 60 years. He was diagnosed not too long ago with leukemia, and so he was on hospice at home. He just passed away this week, but he was at home on hospice, and his hospice nurse, they caught him every day studying the Bible with her. He couldn't keep it to himself. And so this friend of mine and I were talking about the loss of Ed Horton and what a great loss that is to the brotherhood and the kingdom, because of what a great giant in the faith he was in teaching people how to preach the gospel and sharing the gospel with others. And I told him at the time, what really troubles me the most, I've been in ministry for almost 40 years. My dad was a preacher, so I've really been around it my whole life. I can't tell you the number of funerals that I have attended and that I have been instrumental in speaking at. I've sat at the bedside of many people and I've watched them take their last breath. And I've seen the reaction of people that were family and friends. And I've seen in those visitations, in those lines as people come through and they're sad. And I'm like, we have missed it. Because if we believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead, then we know that the grave is not the end. And instead of it being a time of mourning, it should be a time of celebration for Christians. It should be a time in which we're excited because guess what? We finally get to cross out of this life into that which is eternal. Doesn't that make all the difference? I think people need to know that. In a world that lives with almost no hope, we have it. And it's just simply Jesus has truly been raised from the dead. The second thing I want you to notice about this text is not just that when they recognized Jesus, when they saw him, that they had to go tell someone else. I want you to know exactly what it says here in the text about where they recognized him. 2 times the text says, in the breaking of the bread. Now that's a significant phrase to Luke. Because not only does Luke use it here in this text, but he uses it as well many times in the book of Acts, which, as was pointed out earlier, he also wrote. Now, Luke, when he uses this phrase, the breaking of bread, uses it in 2 different ways. One, he uses it in connection to the Lord's Supper. You know, oftentimes we have these tables that they have this imprinted on the fronts of them. Do this in remembrance of me. And we talked about how that Jesus said that right before he was tried and crucified. But obviously that when we break the bread and when we drink the fruit of the vine, we're remembering the body and the blood of Jesus. And when I think about the significance of that, you know, people oftentimes ask, well, what are you thinking about? You know, when you eat of the bread and drink of the fruit of the vine, what's going through your mind? Well, for me personally, I'm thinking about Luke chapter 24. Because that's where they recognized Jesus, and I'm asking myself, do I see Jesus here? I mean, do I recognize him in both the bread and in the fruit of the vine, his body and his blood? That's what I think about. But Luke uses this in another way, which I think has great application for us today. Because Luke also uses this phrase in connection to a common fellowship meal. You know, it's interesting to me. I'm going to tell you this now, but you're going to be thinking about it on Sunday during the potluck. Have you ever just taken a moment that when you share a meal with someone, to look at them, to see Jesus in them, to recognize Jesus in them when you share this meal together? A gentleman called me, I don't know, it's probably been a couple years ago now, but he was trying to revive a congregation in Eastern Tennessee. Anyway, in the discussion, we were talking about a lot of different things. He told me that when he was growing up, his dad said this to him. He said, if you want to keep a visitor, you have to do 2 things. 1, you got to greet them in the parking lot. And 2, you get their feet under your table as quickly as possible. I don't know if it was because we now have a bazillion restaurants. I don't know if it's because we've become more reclusive as we've gotten older. I don't know. Our culture is very reclusive. But when I was growing up, when I was younger, I'm telling you what, there wasn't a Sunday that went by that we weren't in somebody's home or they were in ours. We shared meals together. Because you learn a lot about people when you're sitting across from the table with them, breaking bread, sharing food. Now, Charity and Rick don't know this until now. But we're sitting across from the table tonight, and in my mind, that's what I'm looking for. I want to see Jesus in them, but more importantly, I want them to see Jesus in me. And I wonder how much different it would be that when people are gracious enough to walk through those doors, many of which you have no idea what to expect when they come through them, that when they come through those doors, how do we respond to them? Do we respond in such a way that they see Jesus in us? By greeting them and not letting them leave without first making sure their feet are under our table. I tell you this story because I tell you it was one of the most fascinating things. I've worked with a congregation out in Spokane Valley, Washington, at least 3 times, maybe 4. But I tell you, just a wonderful group of people. They got about 50 maybe in attendance. But they had a guy from Sweden. His name was Jan. I don't know. Some of you guys will probably know who James Dean is. But he was kind of like the James Dean of Sweden. I mean, he had this braided ponytail. I mean, tattoos. I mean, he just oozed cool, you know? And wore a jean jacket. Him and his wife showed up to services. They drove an hour one way to attend. And when they walked in the doors, people greeted them. And they just went immediately, we're church shopping. And that was their way of kind of throwing up this barrier to let them check things out. So they sat down. One of the elders in that congregation went over to them and said, my wife and I want to take you and your wife lunch today. We want to get to know you and spend some time together. So they did. Spent the whole afternoon together. Well, the next Sunday, Jan and his wife showed up. Well, this time, a different member in the congregation went over and said, my wife and I want to take you to lunch today. And so they did, spent the day together. The third week, Jan and his wife showed up. And somebody said to them, we thought you were church shopping. He said, we found our home. So simple, isn't it? Get their feet under your table as quickly as possible. Because that's where you get the chance to let them truly see Jesus in you. You know, sometimes we get so caught up in the fact that we want to study the Bible with them. And I'm not saying that they don't need that and that we shouldn't do that. That's not what I'm trying to say. But what I am trying to emphasize is the fact that before we get there, they probably need to know that we do care about them. Take them to lunch. Have them in your home. You know, it used to be, that's what we did. We had people in our homes. I love that. Everywhere I go, people say, do you want us to put you up in a hotel? I'm like, no. I want to stay with somebody. I want to stay with people because I like to get to know people. I want them to get to know me. I want them to see Jesus in me, and I want to see Jesus in them. I know y'all participate in church camp stuff, and Rick and I talked about that some today. I grew up in church camp, and we used to sing a song at church camp. Have you seen Jesus my Lord? He's here in plain view. Open your eyes. He'll show it to you. I mean, the last verse of this song is what I really like to key in on. Because the last verse says this. Have you ever stood in the family with the Lord there in your midst, seen the face of Christ on each other? Then I say, you've seen Jesus, my Lord. You know, for some people in our world, you may be the only Jesus they get to see. The only reflection, the only representation of Jesus they get to see will be you. And so you and I have to make sure that we're not the reason that prevents people from seeing Jesus. We need to be the reason that people see him. And the reason I say that is because how we see Jesus changes how we see others. Whether we see them through the eye of a Pharisee, a priest or a Levite, or through the crowds, or whether we see them through the eyes of compassion and salvation, through the eyes of Jesus. As we go throughout this week, we're going to be talking about each one of the 4 Gospels. Tonight, as we have done, we've kind of focused on just kind of a key area from the Gospel of Luke. But I hope that when you read through the Gospel of Luke, that you'll begin looking at and highlighting some of those things in regards to not only how we see Jesus, but how Jesus saw people and how that we need to see people through the eyes of Jesus. Because when we do that, it's going to make all the difference. Now, tomorrow night, we're going to talk about how do you see Jesus? What do you see him as? And so we're going to look at a couple of different texts there in the Gospel of John. And we're going to focus on this idea of how we see Jesus, but we're also going to talk about how that changes the way that we see other people in light of that. And so tomorrow night we're going to talk about John. On Friday night we're going to look at how are we using our influence. And we're going to focus on the Gospel of Matthew. You know, Jesus did say in the Sermon on the Mount, you're the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Well, we're going to talk about what those two things mean and how they are used in our way of influencing the world around us and what that looks like from the Gospel of Matthew. And so we're going to try to highlight some different key things from those Gospels. And then on Sunday morning, during the Bible class, we're going to talk about this idea of how do you grow the church? I mean, here you are in Albert Lea, Minnesota. How do you grow this congregation? So we're going to talk about some principles that will help you in thinking about what you need to do to grow this congregation during the worship hour. We're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. And I've simply titled the lesson, Amazed. Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to look at just how amazing Jesus is and why others need to know about him. I'm not sure if I need to. Are we going to sing another song? Nobody said? Oh, well, I'd like to do Q&A. Do you have a question in regards to anything that I've said or anything? I mean, I wasn't given protocol here, but I can't always answer questions, but I always give you an opportunity to ask a question if you have one, and especially in regards to what we talked about in the Gospel of Luke, or even if you got a comment you want to make in regards to what we talked about tonight. Going once, going twice.
I'll give out one.
I knew you would.
You know what?
Listen, y'all know his middle name. I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep that a secret.
I'm not bashful anymore. It's on the wall for a reason. So you know, we looked at what people could see Jesus through us, and we're portraying Jesus. There's a large portion of my life, and these guys know that, but where the betrayal that I said was Jesus was not the portrayal of Jesus. So the false representation that I gave of who Jesus was, and that's a different side of what we looked at tonight, but it's nonetheless, we want to make sure we present Jesus the way he wants to be presented.
Yeah. And hopefully, as we go through these studies, tomorrow night for John, but specifically as we look at Matthew, I think Matthew is the one that really highlights that concept through our words and our actions, and I'll explain that more when we get there. But Matthew will talk some about that, and then, you know, I'll just hold off on trying not to preach all 4 of those lessons tonight. But on Sunday, when we talk about Mark, we're going to really look at this idea of the responsibility that I have because of just how amazing Jesus is. So, well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this week and for being a part of especially the Ironman workshop on Saturday. I'm looking forward to that as well. I love to teach. I love to talk about the Bible. I love to talk about leadership, and so you're going to get to hear a lot of all that this week. So thank you for allowing me to do that and to be able to share some of those things with you. And so I look forward to tomorrow night. Tomorrow night we're going to narrow in on the Gospel of and we'll look at memories and